I'll start again. Avani Kapur is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and leads the Accountability Initiative at CPR. She has over 13 years of experience in governance, state capacity, and public finance. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, she conceptualized the Pulse 4D development platform, seeking to bring the development community together to learn, share, and communicate better with each other. The platform hosts more than 80 organizations. With this, I would like to invite Ms. Kapur to please give us your speech.
We've had a great, interesting morning talking about public institutions and how they were built up, and now we're kind of shifting gear a little bit to look at some of the work that some of these public institutions do. A lot of the work that I lead at the Accountability Initiative is quite similar to the work that CBPS does, and I think collectively all of us have recognized a few things in terms of what we do know and what we don't know. So today I wanted to share with you a little bit of what we've discovered in the journey, and would love to hear your thoughts, comments, questions around on the same. How do I? In all honesty, when I first started working at Accountability Initiative, and that time I was a young researcher, I had no experience on public finance and budgets. And very soon I realized that it wasn't so much about knowing the technical aspects of budgets, but budgets as a window of understanding and decoding issues of state capacity, issues of questions of how services actually get delivered on the ground. So what do we know about the public finance landscape? And I think there are a few things we definitely know. And these are the big picture things that a lot of us and a lot of the media as well, especially around state budgets, around union budgets, focus on. So we know there's 4.8 lakh crores going as centrally sponsored schemes. We know that 6.3 lakh crores going as direct benefit transfers. We also know that these are a lot of the union government schemes, but states are actually doing a lot of the bulk. In fact, just taking the example of health, 77% of the spending is by states. So clearly the fiscal landscape consists of a lot of money. Yet what we also know is that if you look at just pure numbers, traditionally India has always historically been a low spender, particularly on a lot of welfare programs. Health being a primary example, I think numerous policies talk about 2.5% of the GDP, and we're still quite far away from that. And if you compare us with any of our peers, we're still not reaching the levels that you would expect for a country this size. And every time when we talk about the very, very, in some ways, narrow way of saying more money is required by governments, there's often pushback that you have a lot of unutilization amidst the crunch. This is data, for example, from the CAG, which shows that scheme after scheme, you see money not being utilized. So any conversation that we all make, we ourselves saying, oh, you need more money for education, for health, for different community groups, it's often met with this thing, but what about the money that you have? You're not being able to spend it well. We also know that there's significant misallocation of resources. So this is data from the economic survey itself. It showed that these 6 top welfare programs, the poorest districts in the country would imagine would get a larger share of resources. But actually, that's not the case. If you look at it, in fact, it's very, very skewed and not in a way that sounds optimal or realistic. You also have significant mismatch between resources and outcomes. So this is data for education, for instance. You can see a Chhattisgarh and Tamil Nadu or even a Karnataka in the middle. Similar spending, but I pulled out data for Tamil Nadu. I'm sure Karnataka is a little worse, but similar. Whereas in Chhattisgarh, as per the government's own database, only 10% of children scored more than 50% in maths. Whereas in Tamil Nadu, it's 57%. But the amount that the states are spending per child tends to be similar. Similarly, even for reading, 18% versus 50%. So huge difference in actual outcomes at the ground level across states. Yet the amount of money that is being spent across states um, somehow seems similar. But there's the other side of the story also in this same graph, which is there are differences up to 30,000 rupees per student between states. So some of the hilly states, for example, spending a lot more. A state like Himachal spends close to 40,000 rupees per child. A state like Bihar spends a little over 5,000 rupees. This is not just an education problem. We see the same thing even in health. So I don't need to put the data on outcomes here because everyone knows that the way that a Bihar performs versus a Kerala performs in health is vastly different. Yet the amount of money that is being spent on the National Health Mission, which is one of the flagship health programs, is very similar. So 334, 332 rupees roughly. And when you go to the ground, all this talk about money, budgets, is it enough? How much is it? When you go to the ground, you're confronted by a reality that we do live in a world where we have low state capability. These are, I remember very clearly the going to a village where they weren't classifying this child on the left-hand side as malnourished because they just didn't have the people or the quota to do that. So today I wanted to share with you some of what we have learned, and I think what's been great about CBPS's curation of this session is that it's not just about numbers. It's not just about the numbers. It's not just about data. It's about what does that data represent? What are the other factors that are often hidden, often not as visible or tangible as data, that become the reality of when we're talking about public finance and service delivery. This was, I thought, a useful way of looking at, this is Landpritchard's framing of it, which is, in an ideal world, there are certain actions that you expect people to do that lead to outputs and outcomes. In a typical project management kind of style, you put inputs, you have ABCD, everyone has right intentions, things go really well, and then you get the desired outputs and outcomes. But the reality is very different. And it doesn't mean that it necessarily is either or. It doesn't mean that we're always in the ideal state where every person is doing the best possible thing and you get the best possible outcomes. But nor does it mean that you're doing nothing. Often it means that you're kind of somewhere in the middle, where even during a programmatic phase, you could be and start off in an ideal, suddenly go down to a little less than ideal, maybe again go up to ideal. And that impacts a lot of what the finances and the policy side lead to in terms of service delivery. So it's important to remember that measuring state capacity and capability requires actually matching the action of agents to facts on the ground. Not always assuming that people have their best intentions, nor assuming that people have their worst, but recognizing that all of us in a system are made up of human beings who kind of straddle different elements through our work. It's also important to remember that facts are not always facts. And by that, what I mean to say is that you could have a fact saying a state is doing badly in this, but unless you talk about why, or you talk about what is sometimes the competing priorities that states have, you're kind of not being able to see the big picture or the broader picture. So it's not enough to limit the conversation to just saying, oh, Bihar spends 5,000 rupees, or Himachal spends 40,000 rupees, and so Bihar is doing worse than Himachal. Because there's a lot of other factors that actually go into why a state chooses to prioritize or act in the way that it does. So over the last, I think 15 years of accountability initiatives existence, what we've been trying to do is unpacking this across the budget cycle. A lot of the public finance narrative focuses a lot on budget formulation, which is in some ways when how priorities are determined and funds are allocated. But it's equally important, and I think that's been the journey of CBPS for us as well, which is to also look at the execution side of it, also look at the evaluation side of it, and remember this very astute quote in some ways that education department officer in Purnia district of Bihar told us, which is like actually tracking processes and fund flows to some degree are like the blood from is the flow of blood from the heart to various organs. If there are bottlenecks or failures in any one level, it can cause organ damage. Similarly, when you think of processes and fund flows, it is a very similar metric that one should remember. So I wanted to share today, and I don't want to make this complete lecture mode, so I will share with you some of what we learned, and I wanted to then open it up to people for questions, comments, and experience sharing. But I'll start with a little bit of what we've learned in our journey, apart from the facts that I started with, to a little bit of when you're actually digging deeper into some of these questions, what is it that gets unveiled? So the first thing in some ways that gets unveiled is what I call the dare conundrum, though it's kind of, there are two A's, so it's not exactly pronounced dare, but it has a nice ring to it. Which is, if you look at the education large programs, you have an entire planning process that is meant to take place. And these plans are then aggregated upwards into these annual work plans and budgets. These are then meant to be approved by a authority in the ministry, and then you have allocation, release, expenditure. This is typically the way that many of the, at least the central schemes get financed. But at every step of the way, you can see that there's a huge difference between what a ministry demands, what finally gets approved in the plans, what finally gets allocated, what gets released, and what gets spent. It's more often than not this kind of, what is it called? Downward sloping chart that you will see across schemes, across programs. Which then, of course, brought to the question that what are you planning for? Like, did you get wrong in the planning stage, or was the allocation just not enough? So we try to dig deeper into the planning aspect of things. And we started questioning, what does planning even mean? So if you look traditionally and theoretically, everyone will say decentralized planning is the way to go. It's the transfer of political, administrative, and fiscal responsibilities to locally elected bodies. It's the empowerment of communities to exert control over these bodies. But if you ask anyone, does decentralized planning actually work? There's often silence, or, well, maybe in certain circumstances, or if you ask economists, they'll say it depends. When we went to the ground to try and understand, when you're expecting people to plan, what is their incentive to plan? And what actually happens after this planning process? And what we learned was very fascinating things. First of all, we realized that, okay, not everyone plans, which means that these plans that are created may not actually be created at the school level. They are aggregated at the state level, or sometimes even higher. What does that planning process consist of? So we tried to follow this, and we sat in on a few planning meetings. It sometimes consists of like filling this 32-page format. It's a checklist of like countless pages which you're just trying to mechanically and manually fill. You have a planning process in place where you're asking school management committee members to make school development plans. But again, when you delve a little deeper, you realize two things. One is, well, school management committees are not getting paid to do that, and a lot of the parents are actually daily wage earners who have to give up their daily wage to sit and make this school development plan. But what is worse is actually talking to the cluster resource center coordinator and asking them, okay, schools have made these plans, what happens? They said, they're lying in the cupboard. So I said, okay, great, were they used in any form? No, the planning actually happens through UDIs, but it's good, we have them as copies and records in our cupboard. So it was very clear that this entire exercise in some ways was done expecting school management committees to give up their daily wage to go out and make plans, but yet there was no mechanism in place to actually integrate that plan into a formal planning and budgeting process. And we discovered this firsthand. I remember really clearly being, this was I think 15 years ago, being really excited, spending time in a few villages in Sehor district and actually trying to create these ideal school development plans. We spent every month for 10 months, we would go spend 3 days in the village, galvanize people, say, trying to make education a priority, trying to get people to say why they should participate in it, not just in terms of sending their children to school, but more importantly in actually the governance processes and discussions. And at the end of it, we did create this, what we thought and were proud of, this great plan, and very formally went and presented it to a block education officer. Little to realize that actually it went nowhere. Few months later, one of the things that we had proposed for in the plan was to actually fix a leaking roof in the school, which was unable to use it during the rainy months. Monsoon came and went and nothing happened and no money flew through the system. And we were then being asked questions saying, why did we, both all of us, but also more importantly, the village in which we were working, why did they waste their time and spend their time trying to make this fictitious plan? So this is what the planning process looks like. And if you think about it, what would be anyone's incentive to plan, right? So it's not just that people are not following their duties, it's important to understand actually whether it's worth their time and effort to create a plan. Even when you do create a plan, you don't really get what you asked for, with very rarely any explanation of why you didn't get it. So we've heard of states having to do blanket 15% budget cut, 15% cut the budget, which means that a school that had actually tried to make this plan based on its needs, well, that doesn't matter. We've also heard that irrespective of the plan, sometimes orders coming from the center, central authorities, not necessarily the union government, but even the state, with very blanket things of saying every school must now spend money only on, say, a girls' toilet. Not to say girls' toilets aren't important, but I remember being in a school which was literally on the highway. So they said our first priority is getting a boundary wall because we need to ensure the kids are safe. Second priority is the girls' toilet, but not always is that decision left up to people. I remember visiting a school in Bihar where every school got a fire extinguisher because an order had been passed, including schools that didn't have a school building. So this poor teacher who was teaching under a tree would have to carry this fire extinguisher, which if anyone's tried carrying it, they're quite heavy, to her home because you can't leave it. It's state property. So every day, 1 kilometer, carry the fire extinguisher to her school building because no one really asked the school whether they needed, well, maybe you need a building before you need a fire extinguisher. And then these gaps, of course, continue to expenditures. So the story that I began with, which is why are we a country which is resource constrained, spends less on all of its welfare programs, and yet has unspent money lying, which is often the pushback when you're asking for more money across the sector. And you're also in a situation where you don't actually know when you'll get it. So when you talk to people saying, well, why do you have money lying unspent? There's a very human and realistic element, which is, well, if I don't know when I'm going to get my next tranche, or I don't know how much I'll get, I will save it for a rainy day. I will do the stuff that I do need to, but most of the other things I will push to another time where I have a little bit more visibility. So again, this was data saying that sometimes it can take like 242 days for money to be transferred just within a state. So the one on the right shows the state treasury to the state health society, which is the SHS, which is the one that funds a lot of the primary healthcare under the National Health Mission. 242 days just at the state level. Given that our year is 356 days, it's just amazing how can someone survive without knowing how much they're going to get or when. And of course, reaching the last mile, there are even bigger delays, right? So we've been doing surveys in different sectors, including nutrition. And it was amazing that every Anganwadi center, this is pre the recent Sakshanam Anganwadi and Poshan 2.0 guidelines. But before that, every Anganwadi would get just 1,000 rupees a year for just as basic, buy some register, do some little repair, buy a few toys, etc. And yet, when you go down to the ground, you find that this money hasn't reached every Anganwadi center, or when it reaches so late that an entire year may have passed. This is 1,000 rupees for an Anganwadi center. And it's not just about items like that, it's even about salaries. Anganwadi workers across the board often have huge delays in getting their salaries, sometimes even over a 6-month delay. Again, when you're asking people why you're not being able to perform to the best of your ability, you kind of have to understand the landscape in which they function as well. And in this uncertainty, I already alluded to this, what we found is that routine expenditure with clear purpose gets spent. So we try to look at what gets spent, and this is an example of 2 components within the National Health Mission. One is called RCH, which is Reproductive Child Health, and the other is Mission Flexi Pool, which was a nice black box. But when you go deeper, you see that while the RCH component primarily consists of salaries and entitlements and some consumables, it's the Mission Flexi Pool that consists of untied money, awareness building, training, what is often called softer aspects, but they're also the aspects that require a lot more thinking. They're also the aspects that require you to actually have the trust that you'll be able to pay the salaries and entitlements, and you will have that money left over to get to the other side. Because otherwise, it's easier to push trainings, it's easier to push innovation. It's not as easy to not pay people their salaries. So, what ails expenditure? Decoding this capacity to spend, which is often what it boils down to when we talk about public finance management. When we talk about public finance, it's all about, well, are you getting the right amount of money? Are you spending it well? Do you have enough resources for it? And I think what we've learned through our work, and I think through CBPS's work as well, is that it isn't just about money, it's also about organizational capability. Have you been able to equip, enable, and induce people to function to the best of their abilities? Are the rules, processes, and designed in a way that enables everyone to put their best foot forward? Are there the right incentive structures? Is there ability, and is there responsiveness? And while I speak about responsiveness last, it's actually the most important. Responsiveness to be able to deal with situations that often evolve on a daily basis. Responsiveness to be able to actually capture the needs of those on the ground. Unfortunately, what we often have is this, which is a little brief glimpse of what our complicated public finance management system often looks like. There have been attempts to streamline this, but a lot of that streamlining has been done either through direct benefit transfers or through the single nodal accounts that have been created. But most of that is the central money in some ways. Neither does it get rid of the actors involved in actually passing the file, but it also doesn't count for all the other sums of money. And as I started off with, states spend 77% of the money health expenditure. So we do work in a messy situation with multiple treasuries. I have colleagues helping me out trying to decode some of these treasuries data, and others who are helping us from other organizations. In Odisha, we try to count 168 treasuries with different types of treasuries. Of course, treasuries for each district, but you have sub-treasuries, all of which kind of adds to this mess that I showed in some ways. And add to that is the fact that, like I said, even if you make the process, the actual delivery of money faster, there is an entire bureaucracy that is involved in passing that file. So one of the most fun exercises of one of the projects we did was literally following the file. And we found that a file passed through 32 desks just at the state level. What that role of those 32 desks still remains to be seen. But there were 900 transactions being made between states and districts for 1 year. Just imagine the scale and quantum of operations. And I think other colleagues, including those in NIPFP, have found very similar findings of 22 desks, 35 desks across states. So it's not just one state picture. So if most of your time is spent passing a file around, it does raise the question of, well, when do you get to do the other side of the work that you're also meant to do? And then you have, I showed the complicated fiscal structure. This is just a glimpse of a administrative structure of one sector in one state, which is Rajasthan. Now, in conversations with everyone, and right now we're moving towards a world where we have aspirational districts and aspirational blocks. But when we try to study the district administration, you realize that they have supposedly accountability, authority, and some form of engagement with so many actors. A DM is part of I don't know how many committees and programs. They're on one hand meant to look at revenue. At the same time, they're meant to look at judicial and regulatory functions, residual functions, and development functions. And if you start going even deeper into what some of these contain, we found that a typical DC has about 158 responsibilities, ranging from looking at work related to different categories of employees, to promotions, to maintaining supply and records, to courts, to, of course, these important development functions of being part of committees, chairing committees on health, on nutrition, and rural development. And the box gets even more confusing when you try and understand how much of the amount of money that is flowing in my jurisdiction is one that I actually have autonomy or control over. So when we try to do this mapping in Karnataka, we found that Karnataka is, of course, better than many other states when it comes to devolution. But on average, if a Gram Panchayat is meant to get 6 crores, only 3% or 20 lakh, and I'm removing Narega here in this calculation, is planned and spent by each GP. Which means that a lot of that money is flowing in the jurisdiction of the Gram Panchayat, but not something that they have any control, authority, or say over. A lot of that money was for education and PDS. Again, very little involvement of panchayats in most states. Rajasthan, I think, has devolved a lot of functions to Gram Panchayats, Karnataka to some extent, but otherwise you don't really have much say in how that scheme performs or what you can do about it. And in fact, if you go to the ground, most of them are even unaware of the nature and extent of expenditure that's happening in their jurisdiction. Even when you're sometimes part of committees, it's often just a very nominal role that you need to play of a second signatory without actually having too much powers and say in, apart from that. You also are functioning in a system which has high vacancies across the world, across different posts. And what we're increasingly realizing, especially in a world where we're focusing so much on digital, it is often the data entry operators, it's often the accountant and statistical assistants that are missing. In a large country with those 900 transactions in a year for one particular scheme, you have large vacancies. Most of these people are contractual employees. They don't, and so they're not full-time payroll. And of course, you're functioning with an information vacuum. I loved this. This was a picture of, again, a data entry operator's room where you can see the reams and reams of data that is lying in a corner, and you wonder how much of that data is actually usable, used, and used for making any decisions. Because when you actually see on the ground, this is what some of our passbooks look like. I can't read them. I think my colleagues struggle to make sense of them, and it's not just a language problem. It's also that we've suddenly got, we're a large country with heaps of data, even digital data, but often not the manpower or the mechanics to actually look at it. This was an example of average delays since the last update of passbooks and cash books, even though they are still meant to be maintained in physical format. And as a result, you have a system where you're also kind of riding blind, right? Because records just don't match, and understandably so. We saw what that information vacuum looks like. Comparing government data sources across different sources, you can find sometimes lakhs and sometimes crores of differences. And I don't think there's anything sinister going on. It's literally a capacity problem. We've had instances where a DC has, or the junior of a DC has left or got transferred, but we don't have handover processes. So the password got left with that person. Files somehow in the transferring process just disappeared. So that's kind of the state in which we are operating. And so to conclude, I think I would just like to say, yes, finances matter. And I think we're looking forward to hearing all of you present and for some of your take on finances. But I would just conclude by saying that it's not just the finances that matter, because when we're looking at finances, and that's what's been great about all of our work here, is that it's also important to remember the socio-economic, political landscape in which we're operating and the capacity to actually make those funds, functions, functionaries work towards welfare delivery. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Avani, for that very informative presentation. And now I think we can open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question.
Myself, Yogesh Misra. Ma'am, my question is that whether politically name calling the welfare schemes as a freebies rather than entitlement playing a significant role in success of those schemes?
No, I just had this doubt, Vinny, that you said that it's not always, the problem is not the funds, it's also not being able to utilize. But you yourself said it later in the presentation that the whole disbursement calendar is such, which is actually designed for non-utilization. In fact, one senior bureaucrat after his retirement once told me that I think often we do not have the money when we allocate. And so we actually count on their non-utilization because I don't know how far it is true, but that's what the cynical way of looking at it.
So that was a wonderful presentation, Avani. And I just wanted to know, like you have given instances of so many states like Bihar, Karnataka, but there's one state which is very different, which is Kerala, where the devolution is real, 30%, goes to the, so there, the scenario is that somewhat, have you had an occasion to look at the educational institutions, other institutions in Kerala districts? Would you say that they are slightly different, somewhat different from what happens in other states?
I can take these three to begin with. I don't think I need a mic. Acha. Okay. Go on. Put it on. Sorry. No. Honestly, everyone. So, schemes are launched for a. I'll put it here. That way you can still hear. Every single committee, if you study, they all say centrally sponsored schemes are bad, we should do away with them. This happened across the planning commission to now. I'm sure Dr. Vyaslu will know the history even more than I do. And yet, everyone comes in and launches more schemes, right? And it is about taking ownership of programs. I remember an example in Bihar where this was just after the right to education was launched, and Chief Minister Nitish Kumar was very much riding on education as an important area that he was focusing on. So Bihar had launched a lot of these cycle yojanas, uniform schemes, all of that. So RT came and it's there in the minute, so it's publicly available, where Government of India has said you have to now take money for transport and uniforms. Bihar was like, we don't want your money, we have our Chief Minister's schemes already. And Government of India at that time insisted that no, you have to take it. Of course, they took it, it was unutilized. Because for the state, it was important to show success through the Chief Minister program, then through the right to education, that time Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. So I think every political party across the board, a lot of the naming schemes or launching schemes is all about claiming credit. I personally don't care about that as long as the schemes function and do their job, because every scheme's name also changes. Right now, we've seen a large number of schemes. It's hard to keep track. For me, my go-to is always midday meal, even though I know that the scheme is now called PM Poshan, but the essence of what that scheme entails is important. So I think that I think that language of entitlement versus freebies is a flawed one, because the traditional definition of freebies was very superficial in some ways, and it was a little bit more, I don't know, it was a little bit more of luxury goods, televisions to this thing. When we're talking about entitlements, these are basic necessities that we're talking about, and I would say that I avoided getting into that debate, because for me it's about what actually reaches that person who needs it the most, and what do they need is an important question as well. No, I completely agree with you, but that's where I feel like the public finance community also gets stuck. I've been in that pre-budget, union budget consultations that they have, and I was sitting around the room and everyone around the room said, more money for education. I'm also part of those group. Someone else said, but health is a priority, sir, more money for health. Someone else said, scheduled caste. Every single person in that room had a very legitimate, honest, passionate demand. But resources are limited and everyone knows that. So in some ways, the system is designed to fail. I think the challenge that we face, and I've struggled to say more money for something because I get that pushback saying, well, utilization you haven't spent, is to show the mirror saying exactly what you're saying. How am I supposed to spend if you're sending me money on the 31st of March? How am I supposed to spend if you have 900 transactions for that one file, or that file has to move through 32 desks? So let's simplify the processes. You should give the money. So we're trying to, in that sense, change the narrative, because if the second you say more money, it says, but aapke paas, you have money left. So then we've gone and done the diagnosis, so then we give that information back saying, sure, we have unspent, but these are the reasons for that unspent. So it's important to kind of show that as well. On Kerala, I just wrote a piece for a seminar on mission creep, is what the term that we've called it, which is what all of us, as in every state government, does. So yes, Karnataka is a lot more devolved, definitely has a better functional welfare system in some cases, but they are also great at mission creep. And by mission creep, I mean, how do you ring fence the panchayat's money into schemes? And it ties back to a little bit of that credit claim making, right? So the second is untied. I can't really track it. I can't claim credit on it. Even a state like Kerala, where we tried to study Gram Panchayat level finances, we saw attempts at ring fencing it back into government programs. So some of the panchayat money was ring fenced back to pay for the state share for centrally sponsored schemes. So this is a common problem across the board, and I don't think it's any one state. That's why I said it's also a human thing of wanting to control, not really believing or trusting no one. Our advisor T.R. Raghunandan always uses that phrase, which I think is a common phrase, which is everyone loves decentralization up till their level, right? No one likes it below their level. And that's the same case even in a progressive state like Kerala that we've studied. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ankit. I'm a PhD scholar at NIAS. I work on similar issues of debt financing and how developing economies strive through that, in their foreign policy journey. So one thing which I learned in my subject, this term called bureaucratic sludge, also called sludge economy. And whatever I've learned from my recent literature survey is I'm a proponent of decentralization. I mean, that's what my conclusion so far is. So my question to you is, do you think, like you compared Bihar, Karnataka, and Kerala, and there was one more state, and then immediately I realized that definitely they have a different population density. So even though the number per head is equal, so do you think there is a geographical distinction, sort of decentralization required, like a more nuanced approach to decentralization? Thank you.
There was one more there.
Go ahead. Okay. Thank you for your presentation. It was really insightful. I just had a question in terms of your experience. There's been, over the past few years, a lot of focus by the government on the aspirational district program. Now, with that, is that an opening where, we push for, what you are also be talking about, these processes, because we've also sort of done a simple, fund flow mechanism, and it's complicated. How do we use that? And have we seen, the aspirational districts? I know it doesn't cover entire India, but of course they've been selected. So how, has there been any improvement in those districts in terms of their utilization? Is there learnings that we can, take it forward with the other districts, especially if, I think they are also going to be looking at aspirational blocks. So how can we, as a sector, look at, pushing in that area?
It was a very insightful presentation, but I felt like it somewhat painted a gloomy picture, showing a lot of problems. But you did mention in your last set of answers that you are working on changing that narrative and talking about process-oriented changes. So if you could shed some light on certain process reforms that are happening or that can be pushed through to actually improve some of this lack in capacity of the state to actually spend its money and manage its budget properly.
Sure. On decentralization, and then on how do you design, I think the Finance Commission in that sense tries to take into account different aspects to design their grants. I think the centrally sponsored schemes, which aren't a huge chunk in certain states, like I think in Karnataka they're not that important, but for some states they're a big dependency. Those are the ones that are a little bit gray. They aren't always clear metrics on how that is. There is no such thing of allocations. There is only release in centrally sponsored schemes. And by that what I mean is you don't know how much a state is going to get before or even at the start of a financial year. And that's where I think there is an assumption that there will be states that are not able to spend so you can, or will not be able to give their state share so you can reallocate. So that kind of flexibility and freedom exists. The downside is that you don't have a clear formula. So I think the predictability question is an important one. And I think there's been a lot of research by, I think, Stuti Khemani and others who have found that more discretionary fund transfers like CSS tend to be more difficult to spend on precisely for some of the reasons that I shared, whereas the Finance Commission kind of grants like tax devolution, etc., where you clearly know how much you're going to, the formula at least, or the basis on which you're going to get your share is easier to spend on because there's predictability. I know what my budget or resource envelope is. So I think designing schemes keeping that in mind is important. I think for schools, what we were arguing for a lot was you have to look at it in some ways on per child basis, at least within a school. It's changed a little bit, but I remember visiting two schools literally across the road from each other. One was brand new school, 100 students and like some 3 teachers. Another was very old school, like 1920s, like pre-independence the building existed. And 11 teachers, 1,000 students. But because the money was under Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan at that time decided by 3 or more classrooms get a certain amount, 3 and less classrooms. Now 3 and more could mean 10, it could mean 4. Right? And so if your money is based on such a big range, we found that while the schools, there was one school had 26 times the number of students than the other, the amount of money that the school was getting was definitely not commensurate, because the guidelines and norms were not designed keeping in mind, well, maybe we should allocate it per child. I think some schemes have done it well, like midday meal and other supplementary nutrition program, where you're looking at it at the per person level, rather than having these norms based on number of classrooms you have in that building. So I think that design is really critical. And I think studying that, because there's no one perfect design, every program will have to be designed differently, is going to be useful. On aspiration districts and blocks, I'm personally on the fence about it. Technically, the district was never a level of government. We do have a third tier, which in some of the aspirational district conversation, it has kind of wiped them out of the conversation to some degree. Having said that, I think districts have always been an important source of innovation because of that district magistrate having, being able to innovate, having access to a lot more funding. I think that there is definitely things we can learn. I haven't come across too much specifically on aspirational districts. There's not been enough evaluations yet about the success programs. There's like snippets of information. It was a program that had a lot of organizations, including consulting organizations and others, putting in their time and effort. But once they exited, how sustainable, what happened, I don't think there's been enough research on that. And that's an important question as well, because the second you make something a pet project for a certain time, what happens when you withdraw? Have you actually built internal capacity? And I'm always struggling in our state commitment saying, I can come and make this, whatever, clean up your database or tell you something, but I will go and I will not be the one continuously updating it. You have to kind of take it over. We're not a consulting organization, and in any case, we're not the state. But on your point on, I think there's limited peer learning that happens. This platform that Gayatri introduced in my intro, we found young officers, not just DMs, but even like CEOs and SDMs, the younger officers very keen to share their innovation, also to get pushback. But they've just entered their district, they want to do something, they want to share it with the world, they want to connect with other people who've done something, and there are very limited platforms that exist for that. And I think that's going to be the next big thing, I'm hoping. On process reform, sorry, I didn't mean to make it sound so glim. I think it's important though to remember that when it's almost like expectation setting in some ways, which is one has to recognize that there are these constraints, so we are all functioning within those constraints. In terms of what works, I think a lot of it is just trust building also. Why do we have this conflating of accountability? Comes from accounting, comes from this daskat, this comes from having to have this file that moves around. If you can convince someone about the value of other ways of checks and balances, we found that has helped. So in one state where we were working, we said 2-3 things. Cut the red tape, that is unnecessary. One person, it's kind of risk mitigation, because the more people who are signing the file, your risk is getting distributed. But there are ways to cut some of it, because there are those that are willing to take a little bit higher risk, which are higher authorities. But it's also about giving, I know it sounds too simplistic, but it's also about visibility and transparency to those below you. And by that what I mean is, in one of the states where we were working, the blocks had no idea about even when money had come to the state or how much they would eventually get. We told the state, just tell the blocks a tentative resource envelope, just that much. You don't have to give an exact number. You can say it'll be between 50 to 60 lakhs, but it will be at least 50. That allowed them to actually spend, because they had that confidence that, acha, I'm going to get 50 at least. Because otherwise, who wants to take the risk? I'll get transferred tomorrow and suddenly there is that element. So a little bit of communication, I think we found really helpful. technology can play a role, both in terms of visibility. I think that's where technology has done less. Technology has done more for monitoring and evaluation, less for visibility. And by that, what I mean to say is we have a large number of dashboards, but I was talking to Nikhil, who's done great work on the Jan Suchna portal. How many of them are public facing or even internally to those below them? Again, talking to another state government officer who said, dashboard, we want to make a dashboard. I said, okay, great, let me talk to your officers at the block and district level about how can the dashboard help in planning. They were like, why would you talk to them? I want to be able to see and monitor sitting in my room. So how do you use technology to actually use it for visibility to the frontline worker, to the block? I think those kind of conversations, especially in a complex and slightly opaque system, that really helps. Thank you so much. Yes.
I just have one question, if you don't mind, please. Here I am.
Oh, well, I do mind. I was about to close.
Okay.
Okay, please go ahead. Please.
Outside.
Okay.
No, please. I was...
Okay, Avani, in fact, I just stayed back for this session. I was part of the pre-budget session where you and Avantika had facilitated. So I thought this would be a good follow-up for me. But one thing, like the reasons you mentioned for the disparity in the budget allocation and the expenses, I think the reasons what you stated, apart from that, I feel probably it's a professional weakness from an investigative journalist perspective. We look at hidden or underlying issues, what could be the real reasons and root causes for this disparity. That's one reason. I think it's a debatable topic. Can you just give us a reassurance that you taught us how to read the budget on the website? So can we, because we write our pieces based on the numbers what we see there. So given all these disparity and a lot of loopholes here, can we actually go blind and take those numbers while we write our pieces to our stories? So is that numbers real or is it just put up? I just wanted to know what's your take on it.
Expenditure is always better than budget numbers, number one. You will see huge differences between budget estimates, revised estimates, expenditure. So one rule of thumb is look at the expenditure.
Not revised estimates. Revised estimates.
It's second best. But so expenditure side of the story, it's as real as it can get in the sense of it's still not telling you what's happened to that money or how it was spent on what exactly, but it's still telling you that quantum is usually pretty accurate because it also goes through the CAG and there's an entire process. Budget estimates are mostly intent because you obviously don't have that money, right? You're budgeting for the next year where you're guessing how much revenue you will get based on projections, you're estimating how much so those are more intentions. So yeah, so I would say stick to the expenditure numbers and you're safe.
Yeah, at times I would say that they are intentions and at times they are also positions.
Yeah.
You know, not necessarily, even if you don't intend, you at times put it there because it's also, but budget is also a policy tool and a political tool because everyone is actually, looking at it carefully. So certain things are also put there for that sake, knowing well that perhaps you will never back it with real money,
but
isn't
why
it?
looking at the numbers is useful.
Looking at the numbers are
can,
useful. Yeah.
As an investigative journalist, you can call it out if you find something is not going as per the statement, or you can congratulate them for doing a well job.
Yeah, and you will see that the difference is more for certain sectors as compared to others. Difference between allocated and real expenditure is more for certain sectors than for others. And that's where you start questioning even the intent. Isn't it? Yeah. So so this session is not complete. Only this portion is over. We have other part of the session left post tea. So thank you, Avani. And it was... Yeah, and I think, some of the points that you made, and I hope that young scholars who are presenting next in the session, we have 3 paper presentation, will perhaps refer to some of those. And some of the things that she said, and she kept mentioning us also, and anybody who would research those areas using budget as a tool would arrive there, isn't it? See, for example, that process is as important, and process is as archaic as it can be, isn't it? Nothing, you have not seen any change. This last, recently we were looking at everything, you go and you get the same story. You pick any scheme, you get the same story. We were trying to do, some work in those schemes that are not as well studied, like not NHM, not Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, but say scholarship. Most transfers happen in March, and knowing well that if it comes in March, it cannot be spent in April, because it has to go back for revalidation, which takes another 6 months. So if the transfer has come in March, that means it cannot be spent before September. So, but you still do it in March so that it's not non-release. So the money has been released and state has not spent, but state could not have spent because the whole process is such that there's no way they can spend in 2 days. They have to revalidate to spend in next financial year. So, so those are, and that there is obviously, it's not only the process of, only the fault of the process, but also the way that process is appropriated and used. So, there is a political economy there. It's not only a technical issue, it's definitely a political economic issue as well. And and the mistrust. I think those 2 points I thought was so real. Mistrust, and anybody below you is not worthy of trust. So you have to have very rigid controls. That's there. And in my, I'll say almost 3 decades of work, what I have found that even the most, progressive civil servants, they don't trust others, and especially the elected representatives. So that I think those were the points that perhaps we should. So we will break for tea, come back quickly in 10 minutes, and then we'll listen to our young scholars on the issues of public finance and governance.